Sometimes the thing we fear most is exactly what we need to heal our broken hearts. Sometimes the person who looks most dangerous is the one who will keep us safest. Young widow Lila Monroe learned this truth in the wilderness of 1800s Montana. She was alone, running from outlaws who had burned her homestead and killed her husband. When she first saw Elias' bear, Granger, emerge from the forest shadows, she was sure her life was over. The mountain man stood nearly 7 feet tall, with wild hair and a beard that hadn't seen scissors in years. His buckskins were weathered, his movements silent as a predator. Everything about him screamed danger, but Elias had spent 15 years alone in these mountains, and he wasn't looking to hurt anyone. He was looking for something far more precious than gold or land. Could this terrified woman be the answer to his deepest longing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of smoke had never left Lila Monroe's memory. Even now, 3 weeks after watching her homestead burn to ash and cinder, she could taste it on every breath she drew in the thin mountain air. The acrid scent clung to her torn calico dress, her matted brown hair, and seemed to seep from her very pores like a reminder that some things could never be washed clean. She guided her weary mare along a narrow deer path that wound through towering pines, their branches heavy with October snow. Behind her, the rickety wagon groaned and complained with every rut and stone. The axle had been singing a worrisome tune for the past 2 days, and she knew it wouldn't hold much longer. But then, neither would she. Thomas had been dead for nearly a month now, shot down in their own dooryard while trying to reason with the men who claimed his land. They'd called it a dispute over mineral rights, but Lila knew better. Her husband had discovered something in those hills behind their cabin, something worth killing for. The men who'd murdered him wore no badges, claimed no authority, but they'd taken everything just the same. She touched the simple gold band that still circled her finger. 24 years old, and already a widow. The ring felt heavier now than it had on her wedding day 3 years ago, weighted with memories and might-have-beens. Thomas had slipped it onto her finger in the little church in Helena, promising her a lifetime of love and the children they'd both dreamed of raising on their mountain homestead. The wagon wheel caught in a deep rut, jarring her from the bittersweet reverie. Her mare whinnied in protest, breath steaming in the cold air. They'd been climbing steadily for hours, following what the storekeeper in the last settlement had assured her was a passage through the bitterroots. He'd warned her about traveling alone, especially a woman, but what choice did she have? The men who'd killed Thomas were still looking for her. She'd heard them talking that terrible night as she hid in the root cellar, their voices drifting through the floorboards, while flames consumed everything she'd ever loved. The woman saw too much, one had said. Can't leave her alive to tell tales. So she'd run, gathered what little she could carry, hitched her mare to the old wagon and fled into the wilderness. Better to face wolves and bears than the men who'd already proven what they were capable of. The path ahead forked, one branch continuing upward toward the peaks, the other descending into a narrow valley where a silver creek wound between stands of aspen and pine. Her mare favored the downward path, ears pricked toward the sound of running water. They'd been without fresh water since dawn, surviving on what little remained in her dented canteen. Lila let the horse choose their way, too weary to fight anymore. The creek beckoned with the promise of rest, fresh water, and perhaps a sheltered spot to spend the night. Tomorrow she'd worry about the failing wagon axle and the dwindling supplies. Tonight she just needed to close her eyes and forget, if only for a few hours, the terrible weight of being completely alone in the world. The water ran clear and cold over smooth river stones, chattering to itself as it tumbled down from the high country. Her mare picked her way carefully to the edge and dropped her head to drink, the sound of her contentment a small comfort in the vast silence of the wilderness. Lila climbed down from the wagon seat, her joints protesting after Hours of bouncing over rough terrain. She knelt beside the stream, cupping the icy water in her palms and drinking deeply. It tasted of snow and stone and something wild she couldn't name. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of simple pleasure. The water was clean. The creek bed was sandy and level. She could rest here safely for the night. That's when she heard the twigs snap behind her. The sound froze her blood. Not the casual crack of a branch falling naturally, but the sharp report of something stepped on, deliberately. Heavy, purposeful, human. Lila's hand instinctively moved to the rifle Thomas had insisted she carry, but terror made her movements. Clumsy, the weapon slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered against the wagon boards. The sound echoed through the valley like a gunshot. Easy there. The voice rumbled from somewhere behind her, low and careful. But it might as well have been thunder for the way it shook her to her core. Lila spun around, her back pressed against the wagon wheel, and found herself staring up at the largest man she'd ever seen. He stood at the edge of the clearing like something that had grown from the forest itself, easily 6.5 feet. Tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the setting sun. His hair was dark brown, shot through with silver, hanging past his collar in waves that hadn't seen a barber in years. The beard that covered the lower half of his face was equally wild, but his eyes, Lord have mercy, his eyes were the strangest shade of pale green she'd ever encountered, like winter ice over deep water. He wore buckskins that had been patched and repatched, a heavy wool coat that had seen better decades, and boots that looked like they'd walked every mile between here and the Mississippi. A rifle hung easy in the crook of his arm, and a hunting knife the size of a cavalry sword rode at his hip. Everything about him spoke of violence barely held in check. This was how she would die then. Not at the hands of the men who'd killed Thomas, but at the mercy of some mountain savage who probably hadn't seen another human being in months. Maybe years. Please, she whispered, the word barely audible above the sound of running water. I don't have anything worth taking. Something flickered across the giant's features. Surprise, maybe, or something that might have been hurt. He took a step back, his hands rising slightly, as if to show he meant no harm. Don't mean you no trouble, ma'am, he said, and there was something almost gentle in that rumbling voice, despite its power. Just heard your wagon coming down the mountain. Wanted to make sure you weren't hurt. The words didn't match the fearsome appearance, and that somehow made it worse. Lila had learned that the most dangerous men were often the ones who spoke softest before they struck. She pressed herself harder against the wagon wheel, splinters digging through her dress. You're him, she breathed. You're the mountain man they talk about in the settlements, Granger. He winced at the name, and something that might have been shame crossed his weathered features. Folks do call me that, I suppose. Though my Christian name is Elias Granger. They say you killed a man with your bare hands, tore him apart like a wild animal. Ma'am, He stopped himself, jaw working, as if chewing on words he couldn't quite swallow. I did what had to be done. Man was hurting someone who couldn't defend herself. Sometimes that's all the choice you get in this world. The admission should have terrified her further, but something in the way he said it, the weight of old regret, the careful way he held himself back from her obvious fear, made her look at him more closely. His clothes were rough but clean. His hands, large enough to span her waist, were steady and sure, and those pale green eyes held more sadness than violence. "What do you want?" she asked, proud that her voice barely shook. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then looked down at his boots, like a schoolboy called on to recite and found wanting. "Nothing you ain't willing to give, Mom," he said finally. He gestured helplessly at her wagon, her obvious distress, the failing light. "You shouldn't be alone out here. These mountains don't forgive mistakes, and winter's coming on hard." Despite her terror, Lila felt a spark of the stubbornness that had helped her survive the last month. "I can take care of myself. Yes'm, I can see that." There wasn't a trace of mockery in his voice, though they both knew her situation was desperate. "But your axle's cracked near through. You're down to maybe 2 days of grain for that horse." And there's weather coming that'll freeze you solid if you don't find proper shelter. How could he possibly know all that? She glanced at her wagon as if seeing it for the first time and realized he was right about everything. The axle showed a dark crack she hadn't noticed. Her grain sack hung nearly flat, and the sky had that heavy grey look that promised snow before dawn. "I have a cabin," Elias said quietly. "Up the valley maybe 2 miles, warm, dry. Got enough food stored up to last through spring and space for your horse in the lean-to." The offer hung between them like a bridge over a chasm, one that might lead to safety or drop her into something far worse than death. Everything sensible in her mind screamed that following this giant into his mountain lair was the last mistake she'd ever make. But the alternative was freezing to death alone in the wilderness, and she'd already survived more than most people could bear. "Why would you help me?" she asked. The question seemed to pain him. He looked away toward the darkening peaks, and when he spoke, his voice was so soft she had to strain to hear it. "Been alone up here 15 years, ma'am. Gets to where a man starts to wonder if he'll ever hear another human voice before he dies. Maybe I just want the company. Maybe I'm tired of talking to the wind." There was truth in that admission, raw and honest enough to cut through some of her fear. "But not all of it, not nearly all. And maybe you're lying," she said. "Maybe I am." He met her eyes again, and she saw something there that surprised her. Respect. He wasn't offended by her suspicion. If anything, he seemed to approve of it. "But come morning, you'll know for sure. Either way, you'll be alive to find out." The creek chattered on between them, indifferent to human concerns. Her mare lifted her head from the water and whickered softly, as if reminding Lila that decisions had consequences, and night was coming whether she was ready or not. Elias Granger stood patient as stone, waiting for her answer. The rifle in his arms could have ended her life already, if that was his intention. The knife at his hip hadn't left its sheath, and those strange, pale eyes held no threat she could detect, only a loneliness so deep it made her chest ache in recognition. "If you mean to hurt me," she said finally, "there's not much I could do to stop you." "No, ma'am, there isn't." The honesty of it was almost refreshing after weeks of running from lies. At least with this mountain man she knew where she stood. 2 miles, you said? "Yes'm, good trail, easy climb." Lila looked at her failing wagon, her weary horse, the darkening sky. Then she looked at the man who called himself Elias, searching. Those winter-green eyes for some sign of his true intentions. What she found there was harder to name than simple threat or kindness. It was something like hope, carefully hidden but unmistakably real. Perhaps it was exhaustion that made the decision for her. Perhaps it was the memory of Thomas's voice telling her to trust her instincts, or perhaps it was simply the recognition that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the only choice that offered any hope at all. "Lead the way," she said. The trail Elias led them on wound steadily upward through stands of lodgepole pine and trembling aspen. True to his word, the path was well maintained, clear of fallen timber and major obstacles. Even so, Lila's wagon protested every turn of its wheels, the cracked axle singing an increasingly urgent song of impending failure. She walked alongside her mare now, partly to spare the animal the extra weight and partly because sitting still allowed too much time for second-guessing. The mountain man moved ahead of them with the silent grace of something born to these heights, occasionally pausing to clear a branch from their path or check that they were keeping pace. "How much farther?" she called when her breath began to fog in the rapidly cooling air. "Just over that ridge," Elias replied without turning. "Maybe half a mile more." The words were barely out of his mouth when the storm hit. It came with the sudden violence that only mountain weather could deliver. One moment the evening sky was merely grey and threatening. The next, the world disappeared behind a wall of driving snow. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in as many seconds, and the wind howled down from the peaks like something hungry and alive. Lila's mare reared in alarm, nearly jerking the lead rope from her numb fingers. The wagon lurched sideways on the narrow trail, and she heard the sickening crack of the axle finally giving way. The whole contraption tilted at a dangerous angle, held up only by wedging against a boulder. "Stay calm," Elias's voice cut through. The wind as he fought his way back to her through the blizzard. Snow caked his beard and eyebrows, making him look even more like some creature of the wilderness. "We need to get you out of this weather now." "My wagon can't be helped." He was already untying her mare from the traces, his large hands working with surprising dexterity despite the cold. "Leave what you can't carry. We'll come back when the storm passes." The practical part of her mind knew he was right, but the wagon held everything she owned, her mother's china wrapped carefully in quilts, the few books Thomas had brought from back east, the small wooden box that held his letters from their courtship, their marriage certificate, and the deed to the land that no longer belonged to her. "I can't just leave it all," the rest of her. Protest was lost as Elias swept her up in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. One moment she was standing in the snow arguing. The next she was pressed against his broad chest, the world tilting wildly around her. "Hold on," he said, and started up the trail at a pace that should have been impossible in the storm. Lila wanted to struggle, to demand he put her down. But the wind was stealing her breath and her strength both. She found herself clinging to his coat, her face buried against his shoulder to escape the driving snow. He smelled of wood smoke and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her stomach flutter in ways she didn't want to examine. Through the storm, she glimpsed the dark bulk of a cabin taking shape ahead of them, solid logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney already sending smoke into the wild night, windows glowing with warm yellow light. It looked like something from a fairy tale, a refuge conjured from the wilderness itself. Elias kicked the door open and carried her inside, setting her down gently near a stone fireplace that radiated blessed warmth. Her legs nearly gave out, whether from cold or shock or the strange intimacy of being carried in those powerful arms, she couldn't say. "Get yourself warm," he said, already turning back toward the door. "I'll see to your horse." "Wait." The word escaped before she could stop it. The thought of being alone, even in this warm sanctuary, suddenly terrified her more than his presence. He paused, one hand on the door latch, and looked back at her with those unsettling pale eyes. "I'll be right back, Mom. Promise." The door closed behind him, and Lila was left alone in the mountain man's cabin. Her first impression was of surprising order and cleanliness. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with a kitchen area to one side and what looked like a bedroom, alcove to the other. Hand-hewn furniture filled the space, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies. Everything was rough but well-made, built to last by someone who understood the value of solid craftsmanship. But it was what she found tucked away in the bedroom alcove that stopped her breath entirely. A cradle. Not just any cradle, but one carved with exquisite care from what looked like cherry wood, polished to a warm glow and decorated with delicate figures of forest animals. Rabbits and deer danced around the sides, while bears and wolves stood guard at head and foot. It was the work of months, maybe years, crafted with the kind of patience that spoke of deep longing. Beside it sat a small chest, and when she lifted the lid with trembling fingers, she found it filled with tiny clothes. Little gowns and shirts sewn from soft flannel, knitted caps and booties, wooden rattles and cloth dolls. Everything a baby might need, prepared with meticulous care and stored away like treasures. "Those have been waiting a long time," Lila spun. Around, to find Elias standing in the doorway, snow melting from his hair and shoulders. She hadn't heard him return, had been too absorbed in her discovery to notice the door opening. "I'm sorry," she stammered, dropping the tiny gown she'd been examining. "I didn't mean to pry." "No harm done." He moved into the room with that same careful grace, as if he were afraid of startling her. "Figured you'd wonder, seeing them there. They're beautiful." The words came out softer than she intended. "Did you make them yourself?" Something that might have been embarrassment crossed his weathered features. The cradle and such, yes. The clothes? Well, I traded furs to the widow Thompson down in Bear Creek. She's got 5 young ones of her own, and a gift for needlework. The image of this giant of a man carefully bartering pelts for baby clothes was so unexpected it made her chest tight. How long have you been preparing? Going on 10 years now, I reckon. He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking younger despite his graying hair. Started right after I came up here to stay. Figured if I was going to make a home in these mountains, ought to make it ready for a family. 10 years, a decade, of hope and preparation, waiting for someone who might never come. The loneliness of it was staggering, and Lila found herself looking at the mountain man with new eyes. "But there's been no one?" she asked gently. "Few women make it up this high, and those that do are generally passing through with husbands of their own." He moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames with unnecessary care. "Besides, I'm not exactly what most folks would call marriageable material." The comment was made lightly, but she heard the pain beneath it. How many years had he spent alone with his hopes and his carefully prepared nursery, watching the seasons turn, with no prospect of the family he'd dreamed of? "The storm's getting worse," he said, changing the subject with obvious relief. "Won't be safe to travel for a day or two at least." As if summoned by his words, the wind howled around the cabin with renewed fury, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling down the chimney to hiss in the fire. Lila pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried not to think about what would have happened if she'd been caught in this storm alone on the trail. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for helping me. I know you didn't have to." "Yes, I did." The certainty in his voice surprised her. "Couldn't have lived with myself, leaving you out there to freeze." She studied his profile in the firelight, trying to reconcile the fearsome reputation with the gentle hands that had carved baby toys and the voice that spoke of conscience and duty. Everything about Elias Granger seemed to exist in contradiction. The savage and the civilized man, the hermit who dreamed of family, the giant with the tender heart. "Those men I'm running from," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "They didn't just kill my husband for his land. They burned our house with me inside. Or they thought they did." Elias went very still, his hand frozen halfway to the fire poker. "What do you mean?" "I was in the root cellar when they came, heard them talking while the house burned above me. The memories came flooding back, sharp as broken glass. They said I'd seen too much, that they couldn't let me live to tell anyone what really happened. They think I died in the fire, but I got out through the back tunnel Thomas dug for storing vegetables." "What did you see?" His voice was deadly. Quiet now, and she glimpsed something dangerous stirring behind those pale eyes. "Gold." The word hung between them like a curse. "Thomas found gold in the creek behind our cabin. Just a little at first, enough to get excited about, but then he started finding larger pieces, and he got careful about who he told. Said there were men in the territory who would kill for information like that." He was right. Elias's jaw was tight, with something that might have been anger. Gold brings out the worst in folks, makes them do things they'd never consider otherwise. The leader, his name is Wade Hutchins. He wears a deputy's badge, but I don't think it's real. The others call him boss, and they follow his orders like he's some kind of military commander. Her hands were shaking now, and she pressed them against her skirts to still them. "He shot Thomas while he was trying to reason with them. Didn't even let him finish talking." The fire crackled between them, and outside the storm raged on, as if the very mountains were angry. Elias stood slowly, moving to the window and peering out through a gap in the shutters. "They followed you?" he asked. "I don't know. I don't think so. I was careful to stay off the main trails, and the weather's been bad enough to cover my tracks." But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. Men like Wade Hutchins didn't give up easily, and a witness to murder would be worth pursuing. "Even into the high country. We'll know soon enough." Elias moved away from the window, but she noticed he kept his rifle within easy reach. For now, you're safe here. These walls are solid, and there's only one way up that trail in weather like this. The confidence in his voice was reassuring, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that safety was a luxury she could no longer afford. Men who would burn a house with a woman inside wouldn't be deterred by a blizzard or a mountain man's reputation. "I'm sorry," she said. "I've brought trouble to your door." Trouble was coming anyway. The certainty in his voice surprised her. Men like that don't stop with one claim. They'll work their way through every homestead in the territory until someone stands up to them. "And you think that someone should be you?" He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It wasn't just determination or anger, though both were there. It was something deeper, more personal. "I think," he said carefully, "that a man gets tired of running from who he used to be. Maybe it's time to remember that some things are worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning she was afraid to examine too closely. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and somewhere in the darkness beyond these warm walls, dangerous men might already be planning their next move. But for now, in this moment, Lila was warm and safe and alive. And the mountain man who had saved her was looking at her like she might be the answer to 10 years of careful preparation and patient hope. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it made her feel something she hadn't experienced since. Thomas died. The possibility that her story might not be over after all. Morning broke clear and blindingly white over the mountain wilderness. Lila woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, luxuries she hadn't enjoyed in weeks of hard travel. For a moment, wrapped in warm blankets beside the banked fire, she could almost pretend the past month had been nothing but a terrible dream. Then she remembered where she was and why, and the familiar weight of grief settled back over her chest like a stone. "Morning, ma'am." Elias's voice came from the kitchen area, carefully modulated to avoid startling her. "Coffee's ready when you are." She sat up slowly, acutely aware that she'd slept in her clothes and probably looked like something dragged backwards through the wilderness, which she supposed wasn't far from the truth. "Thank you." Her voice came out as a croak, and she cleared her throat before trying again. "I hope I didn't keep you from your bed. I don't sleep much anyway." He appeared in her line of sight carrying 2 steaming cups, moving with that same careful deliberation she'd noticed the night before, as if he were afraid she might bolt, like a startled deer. Besides, someone needed to keep the fire going. Gets cold up here when the sun goes down. The coffee was strong and black, with just a hint of sweetness that suggested he'd added a touch of honey. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup and let the steam rise to her face, breathing in the rich aroma. "How bad is the storm damage?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "Could be worse." Elias settled into the chair across from her, his own cup dwarfed by his large hands. "Your wagon's intact, just the axle that gave out. I can fix that well enough, but it'll take a few days to do it proper." A few days. The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. A few days of sharing this small space, learning each other's habits, pretending this strange arrangement was perfectly normal. "I don't want to impose. You're not." The speed of his response suggested he'd been thinking about this too. "Storm cleared overnight, but there's another one coming in tomorrow. Weather like this, you'd be foolish to travel even with a sound wagon." She nodded, accepting the logic while trying to ignore the flutter of something that might have been relief in her chest. The truth was, she wasn't ready to face the outside world again, not yet. "Is there something I can do to help? I'm not used to sitting idle." Something that might have been surprise flickered across his weathered features. "You don't need to. Please." The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "I need something to keep my hands busy, something to keep my mind from dwelling on things I can't change." He studied her for a long moment, those pale green eyes seeming to see more than she was comfortable with. Then he nodded toward the kitchen area. "Breakfast would be welcome if you don't mind the cooking." Been living on my own efforts for 15 years, and they're not much to speak of." The simple request felt like a gift. Lila set down her coffee and moved to examine his provisions, cataloguing what was available. The larder was better stocked than she'd expected. Flour, beans, preserved meat, dried vegetables, and even a few luxuries like sugar and spices. Not the stores of a man barely surviving, but of someone who planned ahead and valued quality over mere subsistence. "You live well for a hermit," she observed, pulling down a cast-iron skillet that was seasoned to a perfect black sheen. "No point in living poorly just because you're living alone." There was something almost defensive in his tone. A man can take pride in his home whether anyone else sees it or not. She mixed batter for flapjacks, adding a bit of the precious sugar and some dried berries she found in a jar, marked with careful handwriting. Everything in the cabin was labeled and organized with military precision, from the spice jars to the firewood stacked in perfect rows beside the hearth. "You were a soldier," she said. It wasn't really a question. Elias went very still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "What makes you say that? The way you move, the way you organize things." "My Thomas served in the Indian Wars before. We married, and he had the same habits." She flipped the flapjacks with practiced ease, not looking at him directly. "Where did you serve?" "Different places." The answer was carefully neutral. Long time ago now. Something in his tone warned her not to push, but curiosity had always been her weakness. "Is that how you learned to fight? The stories they tell about you in the settlements, most of those stories are lies." The sharpness in his voice made her glance up. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched around the coffee cup. "Or at least they don't tell the whole truth." "What is the whole truth?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Outside, the wind stirred the pine boughs, sending small avalanches of snow sliding off the cabin roof. Finally, he set down his cup and looked at her directly. "The whole truth is that I came up here to get away from what I used to be, from what war made me. Thought maybe if I lived quiet enough, long enough, I could forget the things I'd done." He gestured toward the baby cradle visible through the bedroom doorway. "Thought maybe I could build something instead of just destroying." The pain in his voice was raw and honest, and Lila felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. She'd seen what the wars had done to Thomas, the nightmares that woke him sweating and shaking, the way he sometimes stared at nothing with haunted eyes. "And have you?" she asked gently. "Forgotten?" "No." The single word carried the weight of years. "But I've learned to live with remembering. Most days that's enough." She plated the flapjacks and set them on the table, along with a jar of wild honey she'd found among his supplies. They ate in comfortable silence, the morning light streaming through the windows and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. It wasn't until she was clearing the dishes that she noticed the journal lying open on a shelf beside the fireplace. The pages were covered with careful sketches, plans for expanding the cabin, drawings of garden plots and animal pens, detailed notes about crop rotation and water management. At the bottom of one page, in the same precise handwriting she'd seen on the spice jars, were the words, "Family of 4, minimum requirements." "You've planned it all out," she said, not bothering to hide the wonder in her voice. Elias followed. Her gaze and color rose in his weathered cheeks. "Man gets a lot of time to think up here. Might as well think about something worthwhile." She turned the pages carefully, marveling at the detail. He'd planned for everything, seasons of plenty and seasons of want, the needs of children at different ages, even contingencies for medical emergencies and natural disasters. It was the work of someone who understood that hope without preparation was just wishful thinking. "Why children?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "I mean, why is that what you want most?" He was quiet for so long, she thought. She'd overstepped again. Then he moved to stand beside her, his presence warm and solid at her shoulder. "Had a sister once," he said quietly. "Little thing, barely 5 years old. Sweetest smile you ever saw. Always following me around, asking questions, getting into mischief. His voice grew softer, more distant. "She died of fever the winter I turned 16. Nothing anyone could do, but I kept thinking, if I'd been better prepared, if I'd known more, maybe I could have saved her." The grief in his voice was old, but still sharp, and Lila understood suddenly why he'd spent 10 years preparing for children who didn't yet exist. He was trying to build a fortress against loss, to create something so well-planned and protected that it couldn't be taken away. "I'm sorry," she said. "Long time past." But his hand moved unconsciously toward the journal, protective. "Point is, children are hope, made real. They're the future walking around in small packages, asking to be fed and loved and taught. Seemed, to me, that was worth preparing for. The simplicity of it, the fundamental rightness, made her chest tight with emotion she couldn't name. Here was a man who'd seen the worst the world could offer, who'd done things he clearly regretted, and yet he still believed in the possibility of creating something good and lasting. "Your husband," Elias said carefully. "Did you two want children?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on surviving day to day that she hadn't let herself think about all the futures that had died with Thomas. "Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. "We'd been trying for 2 years. I was starting to think." She stopped, unable to finish the thought. "I'm sorry." His voice was gentle, understanding. "That's a hard loss to carry." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They stood in silence for a moment, two people who'd lost different things, but who understood the weight of dreams deferred. "The journal," she said finally, needing to change the she subject. "May I read more of it?" Something that might have been pleasure flickered across his features. "If you want. Might be boring, though. Just the thoughts of a man with too much time on his hands." But it wasn't boring at all. As the morning wore on, and she read through his careful notes and plans, Lila found herself drawn into the world he'd imagined. It was a world built on hope and hard work, where children laughed in well-tended gardens and families gathered around hearths that never grew cold. It was everything she and Thomas had dreamed of building, rendered in precise detail by a man who understood that dreams without substance were just another kind of loneliness. And despite everything, her grief, her fear, the impossibility of their situation, she found herself wondering what it might be like to help build such a world, to take these carefully drawn plans and turn them into reality. The thought should have felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory. Instead, it felt like the first real possibility she'd encountered since the night her world burned down around her. The second day brought an unexpected domesticity that both comforted and unsettled Lila in equal measure. She woke to find Elias already gone, out checking on her mare and assessing the damage to her wagon. The coffee pot sat warm on the stove, and beside it a plate of biscuits that were only slightly burned around the edges. It was such a simple kindness, but it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. When had anyone last taken care of her needs before their own? She spent the morning exploring the cabin more thoroughly, marveling at the care that had gone into every detail. The logs were chinked so perfectly that not even the mountain wind could find its way through. The windows were glazed with real glass, not the oiled paper or scraped hide that most frontier dwellings made do with. Even the floor was properly planked and sanded smooth, covered with rugs that looked hand-woven. But it was the small wooden toy horse she found tucked away in the chest beside the cradle that truly captured her attention. The carving was exquisite, every detail lovingly rendered in what looked like pine wood polished to a honey glow. The little horse stood in a prancing pose, mane flying, tail arched with spirit. She could see the hours of patient work that had gone into it. The careful shaping of the legs, the delicate carving of the features, the smooth finish that would be gentle under small hands. "You found lightning," she startled, nearly dropping the toy. Elias stood in the doorway, snow melting from his coat and boots, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Lightning. That's what I call him. First toy I ever carved." He moved into the room with that careful way he had, as if afraid of crowding her. Figured every child ought to have a horse, even if it's just a wooden one to start with. It's beautiful. She turned the toy over in her hands, admiring the craftsmanship. How long did it take you to make? Most of a winter. There was something almost shy in his admission. Had nothing but time, and I wanted to get it right. Seemed important somehow, making something that would last. She could picture him by the fire during the long mountain nights, whittling away the hours with nothing but hope and determination to guide his hands. The patience of it, the faith required to keep working on something for a child who didn't yet exist, moved her in ways she struggled to understand. "May I?" She held up the horse, indicating her desire to examine it more closely. "Course." He settled into the chair across from her, his presence somehow less overwhelming in the domestic setting of the cabin. "Everything in that chest is meant for handling. No good making toys that can't be played with." She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, testing the joints, and discovering that the head actually turned on a clever pivot mechanism. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Even the horse's hooves were individually carved, and tiny lines suggested the texture of hair in the mane and tail. "You're an artist," she said, meaning it. Color rose in his weathered cheeks. "Just a man with time to fill and wood to carve. Nothing artistic about it. Thomas always said that art was just love made visible." The words slipped out before she could stop them, bringing with them a sharp pang of loss. "I think he would have admired your work." Something shifted in Elias's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. "You talk about him easily. Your husband. Some folks, they can't bear to speak of the dead." "At first I couldn't." She set the toy horse carefully on the table between them, her fingers reluctant to let it go. It hurt too much. But then I realized that if I stopped talking about him, stopped sharing the memories, it would be like losing him all over again. He was a good man, the best. The words came easily, without the crushing weight they'd once carried. Patient, gentle, never raised his voice in anger. He used to read to me in the evenings, poetry mostly, though he had a weakness for adventure stories too. "Sounds like you were happy." "We were." She met his eyes directly, wanting him to understand. "Very happy. We had plans, children, expanding the homestead, maybe even starting a school for the other settlers' children. Thomas was educated back east, and he believed everyone deserved the chance to better themselves through learning." Elias nodded, slowly, as if storing away each detail for future consideration. "What changed? I mean, what brought the trouble to your door?" The question she'd been dreading, though she'd known it would come eventually. "Gold," she said simply. "Thomas found gold in our creek. Just flakes at first, barely worth the effort to pan. But then he started finding larger pieces. And word got out somehow. Word always gets out." His voice carried the weight of experience. "Gold's got a way of making itself known, no matter how careful folks try to be. The men who came, they weren't just claim jumpers. They knew exactly what they were looking for, exactly where to find it. Someone had given them information, probably sold it to them." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "Thomas tried to reason with them, offered to share the claim, to work something out. They shot him while he was talking." Elias's hands clenched slowly into fists, but his voice remained carefully controlled. "And you saw it happen from the root cellar. I was putting up preserves when I heard the horses coming. Something about the way they rode made me nervous, so I hid. The memory was still sharp enough to cut. I watched through the ventilation grate while they killed my husband and burned our house. Listened to them plan what they'd do to me if they found me. But they didn't find you. The tunnel Thomas dug for storing root vegetables had an exit in the woods behind the house. I waited until they left, then crawled out and ran." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm cabin. "I've been running ever since." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of her story settling between them like a physical presence. Outside, the wind picked up, setting the pine boughs to singing their ancient songs of endurance and survival. "These men," Elias said finally, "the ones who killed your husband, you think they're still looking for you?" "I know they are. I heard them talking about it." The leader, Wade Hutchins. He said I was a loose end that needed tying off. She shuddered at the memory of that cold, calculating voice. Men like that don't give up easily. No, he agreed quietly. They don't. Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was a hardness in his expression now, a coldness in those pale eyes that reminded her forcibly of his reputation. You've known men like that before. I've been men like that before. The admission was quiet, matter of fact, and somehow more chilling than any boast could have been. War has a way of bringing out the worst in folks, making them do things they never thought they could. Difference is, some men find their way back from that darkness. Others just keep walking deeper into it. The honesty of it should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel safer somehow. Here was a man who understood both the capacity for evil and the struggle to choose something better. Is that what you're doing up here? Finding your way back? Trying to. He picked up the wooden horse, turning it over in his large hands with surprising gentleness. Some days are better than others. But I figure as long as a man keeps trying, there's hope for him yet. She watched him handle the toy he'd carved with such care, and something clicked into place in her mind. This wasn't just about preparing for children. It was about preparing to be the kind of man who deserved children. Someone gentle enough to soothe nightmares, patient enough to answer endless questions, strong enough to protect what mattered most. The stories they tell about you in the settlements, she said carefully. About the man you killed. Was he one of the dark ones? The ones who kept walking deeper? Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He was hurting a girl. Couldn't have been more than 15, 16 maybe. Had her tied to a tree. He stopped, jaw working as if the words were too foul to speak. I told him to stop. He laughed at me, said it was none of my business, what he did with his property. So you stopped him? Yes. The single word carried the weight of mountains. Maybe I used more force than strictly necessary. Maybe I let the old anger take hold longer than I should have, but I stopped him. She thought of Thomas, shot down while trying to reason with men who saw murder as merely practical. Thought of herself hiding in a root cellar while evil walked freely in the world above. Good, she said firmly. I'm glad you stopped him. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features. You're not afraid, knowing what I'm capable of. The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Was she afraid? She should be. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed that a man who could kill with his bare hands was dangerous beyond measure. But when she looked at Elias, really looked, she didn't see a killer. She saw a man who carved toys for children who didn't yet exist, who prepared breakfast for a stranger without being asked, who'd spent 15 years trying to become someone worthy of the dreams he'd stored away in a hand-hewn chest. No, she said, and realized she meant it. I'm not afraid of you. The smile that spread across his weathered features was like sunrise after a long, cold night. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger, happier, almost boyish, despite his size and bearing. That's good, he said quietly. That's real good to hear. Outside, the wind continued its endless conversation with the pines, and snow began to fall again in fat, lazy flakes that promised another night of enforced togetherness. But for the first time since her world had burned down around her, Lila found herself looking forward to whatever came next. Perhaps it was the warmth of the cabin, or the gentle way this giant of a man handled his carved treasures. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that sometimes the most unexpected places offered the deepest refuge. Or perhaps it was the growing realization that healing might be possible, even for hearts that had been shattered beyond repair. By the third morning, Lila had established a routine that felt surprisingly natural. She woke before dawn to start the coffee and prepare breakfast, while Elias tended to the animals and checked their supplies. They ate together in comfortable silence, then spent their days in separate but companionable tasks. She mending clothes and organizing his stores, he working on repairs to her wagon and preparing for the next storm. It was during one of these quiet mornings that she discovered her mother's recipe book had survived the journey better than she dared hope. The leather-bound volume was water-damaged and smoke-stained, its pages brittle from the trauma it had endured, but most of the careful handwriting remained legible. Lila spread it carefully on the kitchen table, her heart clenching at the familiar script that had guided her through her first attempts at cooking as a young bride. "What's that you've got there?" Elias asked, settling into the chair across from her with his second cup of coffee. "My mother's recipes. She gave it to me when Thomas and I married, said it was the most valuable thing she could pass down." Lila turned a page carefully, revealing instructions for making wedding cake and christening cookies. "I thought I'd lost it in the fire. Looks like it's been through some hard times. Haven't we all?" She smoothed a page that contained her grandmother's instructions for making soap and candles. "But it's still here, still useful." Elias leaned forward, studying the faded writing with genuine interest. "Your mother's hand, and my grandmother's, and her mother before that. 4 generations of women adding their wisdom." She pointed to a margin note written in different ink. "This is mine, a trick I learned for keeping bread from going stale in winter weather. Would you teach me?" The question surprised her. "Teach you what?" "Some of those recipes. The practical ones." He gestured toward his well-organized but clearly masculine kitchen. "I can keep myself fed, but I never learned the finer points. Seems like knowledge worth having." The request touched something deep in her chest. These recipes weren't just instructions for food. They were family traditions, passed down through generations of women who had found ways to create comfort and beauty, even in the harshest circumstances. "You really want to learn?" "I do." His earnestness was unmistakable. "Been thinking about what you said yesterday, about your husband wanting to start a school. Got me wondering what other kinds of learning I've been missing." She studied his face, searching for any sign of mockery or condescension, but found only genuine interest. It was a strange thing, this giant of a man asking her to share the domestic wisdom that had sustained her family for generations. "All right," she said finally, "but I should warn you, my grandmother was very particular about doing things the proper way. I can be particular, too, when it matters." The morning's lesson began with bread, since they were running low, and it was one of the most essential skills. Lila talked him through mixing the dough, explaining how the weather affected the rising time and why the temperature of the water mattered more than most people realized. "Feel this," she said, guiding his large hands to the smooth surface of the kneaded dough. "It should be soft but not sticky, with just a little give when you press it." His hands were warm and surprisingly gentle, careful not to overwhelm her smaller ones as he learned to judge the texture. There was something deeply intimate about the shared task, their fingers working the same piece of dough while she corrected his technique and praised his quick learning. "You're a natural," she said, as he shaped the loaves with increasing confidence. "Most men I've tried to teach bread making give up after the first attempt. Most men probably don't have as much motivation as I do." Something in his tone made her look up, and she found him watching her with an expression that made her pulse flutter. There was warmth in those pale eyes, and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. "What kind of motivation?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "The kind that comes from wanting to be worthy of the woman doing the teaching." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she busied herself with covering the rising loaves with a clean cloth. "Elias, I know it's too soon." His voice was gentle, understanding. "I know you're still grieving your husband, still healing from everything you've lost. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." "Then what are you asking for?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hands still dusted with flour from their bread-making lesson. When he spoke, his voice was so soft she had to lean closer. To hear him. "Time," he said simply. Time to show you that not all men are like the ones who hurt you. Time to prove that some promises are worth keeping, some dreams worth building toward. The honesty of it took her breath away. No pressure, no demands, just an offer of patience and the hope that something good might grow from the ashes of her old life. "And if I can never be what you're hoping for," she asked, "if I can never be more than a woman seeking shelter from a storm, then you'll still be welcome here, for as long as you need sanctuary." The certainty in his voice was unshakable. "But I don't think that's all you are, Lila Monroe. I think you're stronger than you know and braver than you believe." She wanted to protest, to list all the ways she'd failed and all the reasons she was broken beyond repair, but something in his steady gaze stopped her. He was looking at her like she was something precious, something worth cherishing rather than pitying. "The bread," she said, needing to break the intensity of the moment, "will rise just fine while we figure out what comes next." But he moved to check on the loaves anyway, giving her space to process what had passed between them. The rest of the morning continued with cooking lessons, but something fundamental had shifted. Every shared task felt charged with new meaning. His questions about seasoning soup became inquiries about building a life together. Her instructions about preserving vegetables became glimpses of the future they might share. When he asked her to show him how to make her grandmother's apple preserves, she found herself talking about the orchard Thomas had planned to plant, the children they'd hoped to teach the proper way to pick fruit without bruising it. "You could still have that," Elias said quietly as they worked. "An orchard, I mean. Children to teach. This valley's got good soil for fruit trees. I'm not sure I remember how to hope for things like that anymore. Maybe that's something I could teach you then. How to hope again." She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who'd spent 10 years preparing for a family that existed only in his dreams, and realized he might be the only person in the world qualified to teach such a lesson. The afternoon brought another snowfall, trapping them inside. With the warm bread cooling on the windowsill and the comfortable silence of two people learning to exist in the same space, Lila found herself watching him as he carved another toy, a small wooden bear this time, complete with movable arms and legs. "For a girl," he explained when he caught her looking. "Boys need horses, but girls need something they can cuddle." The assumption that he would have both sons and daughters, that his carefully planned family would include children of every temperament and need, spoke to an optimism that both amazed and humbled her. "How can you be so certain?" she asked. "How can you keep preparing for something that might never happen?" He set down his carving knife and looked at her directly. "Because the alternative is giving up on the best parts of being human. Love, family, the chance to build something that lasts beyond your own lifetime. These aren't luxuries, Lila. They're necessities. Without them, we're just animals surviving instead of people truly living." The conviction in his voice was absolute, unshaken by years of solitude or the hard realities of frontier life. It was the faith of a man who understood that hope was a choice, not a feeling. "And if I stayed," she said carefully, testing the words as much as the idea, "if I helped you build this dream of yours, what would you expect in return?" "Nothing you're not willing to give freely." His answer came without hesitation, a partnership based on respect and growing affection, not obligation. "Children, if we're blessed with them and you're willing. A life built on the understanding that we're both choosing this every day because it makes us better than we could be alone." It wasn't a declaration of love, though she sensed that deeper emotion waiting in the wings. It was something rarer and more precious, an offer of true partnership built on honesty and mutual respect rather than desperation or convenience. The wooden bear in his hand seemed to watch her with patient eyes, waiting like its creator for her answer to questions she wasn't quite ready to ask. The fourth night brought the worst storm yet, a howling fury that seemed determined to tear the cabin from its foundations. Wind shrieked through the pine tops and sent snow spiraling down, the chimney in violent gusts that made the fire dance and smoke. The shutters rattled despite Elias's careful latching, and somewhere in the darkness, beyond the walls, Lila could hear trees groaning under the weight of ice and wind. She woke to the sound of something crashing against the side of the cabin, a branch most likely torn loose by the gale. The fire had burned low, and the temperature inside had dropped enough that she could see her breath in the dim light. "Elias?" she called softly, but received no answer from the main room where he'd been sleeping on a makeshift bedroll by the hearth. Another crash, this one closer to the windows, made her decision for her. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and crept from the sleeping alcove, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. She found him standing at the window, peering out through a gap in the shutters, with the kind of alertness that spoke of years spent reading the wilderness for signs of danger. He'd pulled on his pants and boots but remained shirtless, and in the firelight she could see the network of scars that crossed his back and shoulders, some thin and precise like knife wounds, others broader and more ragged. "Is everything all right?" she whispered. He turned at her voice, and she saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Not fear exactly, but a kind of focused attention that reminded her he'd once been a soldier. "Probably nothing," he said quietly, "but something's got the horses spooked, and it's not just the storm." As if summoned by his words, her mare whinnied. From the lean-to, a sound of genuine distress that cut through the wind. It was answered by a deeper call from Elias's stallion, and then both animals went silent in a way that was somehow more ominous than their earlier cries. "Could be a bear," Elias said, but his hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped beside. "The door, or wolves. Storm like this drives predators to look for shelter, same as anything else." But something in his tone suggested he didn't believe his own reassurance. Lila moved closer to the window, trying to see through the swirling snow, and caught a glimpse of something that made her blood freeze, a light. Distant and flickering, barely visible through the storm, but unmistakably artificial, and moving. "Elias," she breathed, pointing toward the faint glow. He followed her gaze and went very still. The light disappeared for a moment, lost behind the driving snow, then reappeared closer to the cabin. Then another light joined it, and another. "Get dressed," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of absolute command. "Quickly and quietly. Leave anything that might make noise." Lila didn't argue. She retreated to the sleeping alcove and pulled on her clothes with hands that shook only slightly, her mind racing through possibilities. It could be lost travelers seeking shelter, but what kind of travelers would be out in weather like this? It could be hunters or trappers, driven to desperation by the storm, or it could be the men who'd killed Thomas, finally tracking her to this remote sanctuary. When she emerged, Elias was fully dressed and armed, his rifle slung across his back, and the big hunting knife at his hip. He'd banked the fire to coals and extinguished the oil lamp, leaving them in near darkness. "The root cellar," he said quietly, "behind the woodpile. There's a tunnel that leads to a cave system about 50 yards up the slope. What about you? I'll be right behind you, soon as I see what we're dealing with." "No!" The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "I won't hide while you face danger alone. Not again." He looked at her sharply. "Lila!" I said no. She moved to where he'd stored her possessions, retrieving the rifle Thomas had insisted she carry. Her hands were steady now, memory and muscle taking over where conscious thought might fail. "I've run from these men long enough. If they've found me, it ends here." "You don't understand what you're asking." "I understand perfectly." She checked the rifle's load with practiced ease, Thomas's patient lessons coming back to her despite the months of disuse. "I understand that good. People don't hide while evil walks free in the world. I understand that some things are worth fighting for." The lights were closer now, at least 4 of them moving with the purposeful coordination of men who knew their business. As they watched, the glow resolved into torches carried by riders, picking their way carefully up the mountain trail. "Could still be travelers," Elias said, but his voice carried no conviction. "No," Lila said quietly. Travelers would call out, announce themselves. These men are trying to approach unseen. He studied the approaching riders for another moment, then nodded grimly. You're right. Question is, do they know you're here? Or are they just checking every cabin in the territory? The answer came sooner than expected. One of the riders spurred his horse forward and called out in a voice that carried clearly over the wind. Lila Monroe, we know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody else needs to get hurt. Wade Hutchins. Even distorted by the storm, she recognized that cold, calculating voice, the last sound Thomas had heard before the bullet took his life. How many? Elias asked, his earlier gentleness replaced by something harder and more dangerous. At least 4, maybe more. She peered through the shutters, trying to count the lights. Hutchins is their leader. The others follow his orders without question. Military? Some of them, I think. They move like soldiers. Elias was quiet for a moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to command. They'll try to surround the cabin first, cut off any escape routes. Then they'll either try to burn us out or rush the doors. He moved to a chest beside the fireplace and withdrew items that clinked softly in the darkness. Good news is, this place was built to withstand more than weather. Bad news is, we're outnumbered and they know we're here. What do you need me to do? The question seemed to surprise him. He paused in his preparations, looking at her with something that might have been admiration. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Thomas taught me to shoot, said a woman on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself and her family. The words came steadily despite the memories they brought. I'm not as good as you probably are, but I can hit what I'm aiming at. That's all anyone can ask for. He handed her a box of cartridges and a powder horn. Stay low, pick your targets carefully, and don't hesitate when the time comes. Hesitation gets people killed. The riders had stopped just outside the ring of light from the cabin's windows, close enough to be heard, but far enough to avoid easy shots. Hutchins called out again, his voice carrying false reasonableness. We're not unreasonable men, Mrs. Monroe. Just want to have a conversation about some property that rightfully belongs to us. Send out the mountain man, and we'll discuss this civilized-like. They want to separate us, Lila said quietly. Not going to happen. Elias checked his rifle one final time, then moved to a position beside the window where he could cover the main approach. Whatever happens, we face it together. The simple declaration hit her harder than any elaborate promise could have. Here was a man willing to risk everything for a woman he'd known less than a week, not because he expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. Elias, she said softly. He looked at her, and in the dim light she saw not the feared mountain man of frontier legend, but simply a good man preparing to defend what mattered most. If we don't make it through this, we will. The certainty in his voice was absolute. But just in case, what is it? She moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his pale eyes, close enough to feel the steady warmth of his presence. I want you to know that these last few days, they've been the first time I felt truly safe since Thomas died. The first time I've been able to imagine a future worth living. She reached into her pocket and withdrew something she'd been carrying since the night of the fire, a small river stone, perfectly smooth and warm from her body heat. My grandmother used to say that mountain folk had their own way of proposing marriage, that a man would carry a special stone until he found the right woman to offer it to. Elias stared at the stone in her outstretched palm, his expression unreadable. Lila, I'm not asking for promises we might not live to keep, she said quickly. I'm just saying that if we survive this, if we have the chance to build the life you've been preparing for, I'd like to be part of it. I'd like to help you fill that cradle and teach those children and tend that garden you've planned so carefully. For a moment, the storm and the approaching danger faded away. There was only this man and this woman, this moment of connection, in the face of overwhelming odds. Then Elias reached out and closed her fingers gently around the stone. Keep it safe for me, he said quietly. "When this is over, I'll ask you proper-like, the way a woman deserves to be asked. Mrs. Monroe." Hutchins' voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Time's up! Come out now, or we start shooting." The spell was broken. Elias moved to his position by the window, and Lila took up her post on the opposite side of the cabin. Outside, she could hear the soft sounds of men positioning themselves, the creak of saddle leather, and the whisper of weapons being readied. "Remember," Elias said softly, "they need you alive. That gives us an advantage. What about you?" His smile was sharp as winter starlight. "Let's just say it's been a long time since I had something worth fighting for. They're about to learn what that means." The first shot came without further warning, shattering the silence and sending splinters flying from the cabin door. It was answered immediately by Elias's rifle, and someone outside screamed in pain and anger. The battle for the mountain had begun. The attack came at dawn with brutal efficiency. 4 men on horseback burst from the tree line, their weapons all ready, firing as they charged toward the cabin. Elias's first shot took down the lead rider, but the others kept coming, spreading out to flank the building, while maintaining a withering fire that sent bullets splintering through shutters and doorframe. "Stay down!" Elias shouted over the gunfire, working his rifle with practiced speed. Each shot was deliberate, economical, the movements of a man who'd learned to kill efficiently and without waste. Lila pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her heart hammering as bullets whined overhead. She could hear the attackers, shouting to each other, coordinating their assault with the precision of experienced fighters. "Around back, Pete. Watch the windows, Tommy." The voice belonged to Wade Hutchins, and it carried the authority of command. But something about it nagged at her, a familiarity that went beyond their brief encounter at her homestead. She risked a glance through the shattered remains of the shutter and saw Hutchins directing his men with hand signals, his movements sharp and economical. Everything about him screamed military training, from the way he held his weapon to the tactical awareness that kept him in cover while orchestrating the attack. "Elias!" she called. "They're trying to flank us." He shifted position, sending 2 quick shots toward the back of the cabin where movement flickered between the trees. Someone cursed, and the flanking movement stalled. "How many do you see?" he asked, reloading with smooth efficiency. 3 still mounted, maybe 1 more on foot. She squinted through the chaos, trying to get an accurate count, but there could be more in the trees. As if summoned by her words, another rifle cracked from the forest, and the bullet took a chunk out of the log beside her head. She ducked back, her pulse racing. "They're good," Elias said grimly. "Too good for common claim jumpers." The shooting continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the gunfire stopped. An ominous silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the wind in the pines and the nervous whickering of horses. "Monroe!" Hutchins called from somewhere in the trees. "You've cost me 2 good men already. Come out now, and I might let your mountain man live." Lila looked at Elias, seeing her own skepticism reflected in his pale eyes. Men like Hutchins didn't make bargains they intended to keep. "What do you want with me?" she called back, playing for time while Elias repositioned himself for a better shot. "Just want to clear up some confusion about your husband's claim. Legal matter, nothing personal." The lie was so transparent it would have been laughable under other circumstances. But something in Hutchins's tone, that underlying familiarity, finally triggered the memory that had been lurking at the edge of her consciousness. She'd heard that voice before, not just at her homestead, but earlier, much earlier. "You were there," she breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "The day Thomas filed his claim in Helena, you were in the territorial office." Elias shot her a sharp look. "What?" "Hutchins. He was there when Thomas registered our land. He heard about the gold, knew exactly where to find it because he was listening when Thomas talked to the clerk about mineral rights. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This isn't random claim jumping. It's systematic theft, backed by someone with access to official records." The implications were staggering. If Hutchins had inside information about every claim filed in the territory, how many other families had been murdered for their discoveries? How many homesteads had burned while corrupt officials looked the other way? "You're starting to understand," Hutchins called, apparently catching some of their whispered conversation. "Your husband wasn't the first to find gold on his claim, and he won't be the last. But he was fool enough to file it legal-like, putting his name in all the right books for folks like me to read. You're the territorial deputy," Lila realized, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "The one who's supposed to protect settlers from men like yourself. Deputy Marshal Wade Hutchins. At your service." The mockery in his voice was poisonous, though I prefer to think of myself as a businessman with access to valuable information. Amazing what folks will pay for the location of a good gold claim, especially when it comes with guaranteed legal protection. The truth hit her like an avalanche. This wasn't just about Thomas's gold. It was about a systematic operation to rob and murder settlers across the territory, with the law itself providing cover for the crimes. "How many?" she called, her voice shaking with rage more than fear. "How many families have you killed?" Lost count after the first dozen. Hutchins' casual admission was like a knife to the heart. "But don't worry. You'll be joining them soon enough, and this whole unpleasant business will be finished." Elias had gone very still beside her, his rifle held ready, but his attention fixed on something beyond the cabin. When he spoke, his voice carried a deadly quiet that raised the hair on her arms. "They're moving," he said softly, "getting ready for a final rush." She could see it too, now that she knew what to look for. Shadows shifting in the tree line, horses being repositioned, the subtle preparations of men getting ready to overwhelm their target through sheer audacity and firepower. "When they come," Elias said, checking his ammunition, "they'll come hard and fast. No mercy, no quarter. You understand what that means?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. This wouldn't be like the battles in storybooks with noble gestures and last-minute reprieves. This would be brutal and final, with the victors writing their own version of history. "Lila," his voice made her look at him directly, "whatever happens, I need you to know, these last few days have been the best of my life. Not because of what might have been, but because of what was. You gave me hope again, and that's a gift. Beyond measuring. Don't talk like we're already dead," she said fiercely. "We're not dead yet." "No," he agreed, and his smile was sharp as winter starlight. "We're not." The attack came without warning. 6 men on horseback burst from cover simultaneously, charging the cabin from 3 different directions while laying down covering fire. Their coordination was flawless, their timing perfect. The assault of men who'd done this before and expected it to work. Elias's rifle spoke first, and one of the riders tumbled from his saddle. But the others kept coming, and suddenly the cabin was surrounded by the thunder of hoofbeats and the deadly whisper of bullets. Lila fired through her window, saw one of the attackers jerk back in his saddle, but keep riding. She worked the rifles. Action, fired again, and this time her target went down hard, but there were too many of them and they were too close. She heard the crash of the front door giving way, saw Hutchins himself burst into the main room with a revolver in each hand. "Drop your weapons!" he shouted, but his eyes were wild with bloodlust, and she knew he had no intention of taking prisoners. Elias spun from his position at the window, his rifle swinging around to bear on the intruder. But Hutchins was already firing, and she saw Elias stagger as a bullet took him high in the shoulder. Time seemed to slow. She saw Hutchins's second pistol swinging toward her, saw the cruel satisfaction in his eyes as he prepared to end the chase that had brought him so far into the mountains. She fired without conscious thought, her mother's old rifle bucking in her hands. The bullet took Hutchins' center mass, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the kitchen table. But even wounded, the corrupt deputy wasn't finished. He struggled to his knees, blood spreading across his shirt, and raised his remaining pistol with shaking hands. "Should have minded your own business," he gasped. The shot rang out like thunder in the confined space. But it wasn't Hutchins who fired. Elias stood swaying in the doorway, his rifle smoking in his hands and blood running down his arm. Behind him, she could see the bodies of the other attackers sprawled in the snow. Hutchins looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, then up at Elias with something that might have been respect. "Damn," he said quietly. "Should have brought more men." He pitched forward and lay still. The silence that followed was deafening. Lila's ears rang from the gunfire, and smoke drifted through the cabin like fog. Elias leaned heavily against the doorframe, his face pale, but his eyes alert. "Is it over?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "For now, but there'll be questions. Official questions." She moved to help him, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind his wounded shoulder. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing bone and major vessels, but he'd lost enough blood to make him unsteady on his feet. What kind of questions? The kind that come when a territorial deputy marshal turns up dead in the mountains. His voice was grim despite their victory. Hutchins might have been corrupt, but he wore a badge. That makes this complicated. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the broken door. Many horses, moving at speed up the mountain trail. Lila felt her heart sink. More of Hutchins's men, coming to finish what their leader had started. But when the riders burst into the clearing, they weren't wearing the rough clothes of claim jumpers and killers. They wore the blue uniforms of the United States Army, and their leader bore the silver bars of a cavalry captain. "Stand down!" the officer called, his men spreading out to surround the cabin with military precision. "This is Captain Morrison, 1st Cavalry. Everyone come out with your hands visible." Elias exchanged a look with Lila, then called back, "We're coming out. One of us is wounded." They emerged slowly, Lila supporting Elias as he favored his injured shoulder. The soldiers had their weapons ready but not aimed, and Captain Morrison himself was a man of middle years, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested competence rather than corruption. "You'd be Elias Granger," the captain said. It wasn't a question. "I am, and you'd be here about the shooting, among other things." Morrison's gaze took in the bodies scattered around the clearing, the damaged cabin, and Lila's obvious distress. "We've been tracking Deputy Marshal Hutchins and his associates for the better part of 2 months. Suspected corruption but couldn't prove it until—" He gestured toward the carnage around them. "Until now," Morrison nodded grimly. "We found evidence of at least 15 homesteads that were attacked after their owners filed mineral rights claims. Hutchins was selling information to claim jumpers and taking a percentage of whatever they stole." "Then this is over?" Lila asked, hardly daring to hope. "The immediate threat, yes, but there'll be a formal inquiry, testimony to give, paperwork to file." The captain's expression softened slightly. "However, given what we've learned about Deputy Marshal Hutchins's operation, I suspect you'll find the territorial authorities very understanding about the circumstances of his death." Relief flooded through her so suddenly that her knees nearly gave out. It was truly over. The running, the fear, the weight of being hunted across half the territory. She was free to make her own choices about the future. And when she looked at Elias, saw the hope dawning in his pale eyes despite his pain, she realized she'd already made the most important choice of all. The mountain stone was still warm in her pocket, waiting for the right moment to bridge the gap between 2 hearts that had found their way home. The cavalry's arrival brought an end to immediate danger, but ushered in a new kind of uncertainty. Captain Morrison proved to be a thorough and methodical man, spending 3 days at the cabin, taking statements, examining evidence, and piecing together the full scope of Hutchins's criminal operation. Lila found herself telling her story again and again, to Morrison, to his lieutenant, to a federal marshal who arrived on the 2nd day with a satchel full of legal documents and an air of grave authority. Each telling was easier than the last, as if speaking the truth aloud somehow lessened its power to hurt her. Elias recovered quickly from his shoulder wound, though he favored the arm, and tired more easily than usual. The soldiers had brought a field surgeon who cleaned and properly dressed the injury, pronouncing it minor, but recommending rest and limited activity for at least a week. "Fortunate shot," the surgeon commented as he worked. "Few inches lower, and it would have nicked the lung. Few inches higher, and you'd have lost the use of that arm permanently." "Wasn't fortune," Elias replied quietly. "Was Lila's quick shooting that saved us both." The praise made her flush with something that was part embarrassment, part pride. She'd never thought of herself as a fighter, but when the moment came, she'd acted without hesitation. Thomas would have been proud. It was on the third evening, after the last of the officials had departed and they were finally alone again, that Elias brought out the items that would change everything. She was mending a tear in his shirt, the bullet hole, actually, when he emerged from the bedroom alcove carrying something wrapped in soft leather. His movements were careful, reverent, as if he held something precious beyond measure. "There's something I need to show you," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Something I've been carrying for a long time." The leather wrapping fell away to reveal a military medal, bronze and tarnished with age, hanging from a faded ribbon that had once been blue. But it was the inscription that made her breath catch. "Sergeant Elias J. Granger, 1st Colorado Infantry, Medal of Honor, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." "You never said," she whispered, "wasn't something I was proud of." His fingers traced the medal's edges with obvious reluctance. "This was for what happened at Sand Creek. What I did there." The name sent a chill through her. Even in the remote territories, people had heard whispers of Sand Creek, the massacre that had stained the Army's reputation and haunted the men who'd been forced to participate. "Tell me," she said quietly. He was silent for so long, she thought. He might refuse. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Colonel Chivington ordered us to attack a peaceful village. Said they were hostiles, but we all knew better. Women, children, old men who'd come in under a flag of truce." His hands clenched slowly into fists. Most of the boys just followed. Orders. Did what they were told because that's what soldiers do. But not you. I tried to stop it. When I saw what was really happening, I turned my rifle on my own men, saved maybe a dozen Cheyenne children, got them to safety while the massacre went on around us. His laugh was bitter as winter wind. "They gave me this medal for saving American lives under fire, never mentioned that the fire was coming from other Americans, or that the lives I saved weren't the ones they cared about." The pieces fell into place. His exile to these mountains, his determination to build rather than destroy, the careful patience with which he'd prepared for a family he might never have. "That's why you came here," she said. "You weren't running from who you were. You were trying to become someone worthy of redemption. Been 15 years of trying. Some days I think I'm getting closer. Others," he shrugged, wincing slightly, as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "Others, I remember Sand Creek and wonder if some sins are too big for any amount of good intentions to wash clean." She set down her mending and moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his scarred hands in her smaller ones. The medal lay between them, a tangible reminder of choices made in impossible circumstances. "My grandmother used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing the right thing despite being afraid." She met his eyes directly, seeing the pain and doubt that lived there alongside the strength. "You stood against your own army to protect innocent children. If that's not courage, I don't know what is." It didn't feel courageous. It felt like the only choice I could live with. Maybe that's what real courage is. Not the grand gestures, but the quiet decisions to choose compassion over convenience, protection over profit. She traced the medal's inscription with one finger. "You've spent 15 years trying to atone for something that wasn't your fault in the first place. Maybe it's time to forgive yourself." He caught her hand in both of his, holding it against the medal's warm surface. "And if I can't, if the memories never stop coming, The nightmares never end. What then? Then we face them together. The words came without hesitation, surprising her with their certainty. Your past doesn't define you, Elias. What you choose to do tomorrow, that's what matters. Something shifted in his expression, a lightening that made him look younger despite his years. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. Is that your answer then, to what I asked during the storm? She thought of the mountain stone in her pocket, of the careful plans in his journal, of the cradle waiting patiently in the bedroom alcove. Most of all, she thought of the man who'd spent a decade preparing to love a family that existed only in his hopes. Ask me again, she said softly. Ask me properly, the way you promised. He stood slowly, drawing her up with him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the firelight. Then he reached into his own pocket and withdrew a stone similar to the one she carried. Smooth river rock, worn to perfection by countless seasons of water and wind. Lila Monroe, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his pale eyes. I know I'm not much of a bargain. I'm too old, too scarred, too set in my ways. I've got more ghosts than a man deserves, and a reputation that scares children and makes decent folks cross the street. Elias, let me finish. His smile was gentle but determined. I also know that I love you more than I ever thought possible, not just for what you might become, but for who you are right now, brave and kind and strong enough to see past the monster everyone else thinks I am. I love your laugh and the way you hum while you cook, and how you make my rough cabin feel like a real home just by being in it. The stone in his palm caught the firelight, smooth and perfect as a promise. I'm asking if you'll have me, Lila, if you'll help me build the life we've both been dreaming of, if you'll let me spend whatever years I have left trying to be worthy of the gift of your love. The question hung between them like a bridge across the chasm of loss and loneliness they'd both endured. She thought of Thomas, of the love they'd shared and the future that had been stolen from them. Then she thought of Elias, of the patient way he'd prepared for a family, of his gentle hands carving toys for children who didn't yet exist. Thomas would have wanted her to be happy, would have approved of this giant of a man who spoke of love as a partnership and saw children as hope made flesh. She reached into her pocket and withdrew her own stone, placing it in his free hand alongside his own. Yes, she said simply, yes. To all of it. The kiss that followed was gentle and fierce at the same time, full of promise and possibility. When they finally broke apart, both stones had warmed to the temperature of their joined hands. In the old tradition, Elias said softly, we're married now. The stones make it official. And in the new tradition, we'll have the preacher say words over us when the circuit rider comes through in spring. But as far as I'm concerned, you've been my wife since the moment you chose to stay and fight beside me. The word wife should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. They spent the evening making plans, talking through the practical details of building a life together. The cabin would need expanding before winter returned. The lean-to should become a proper barn. They'd need to clear more land for crops, maybe build a smokehouse, definitely construct a larger root cellar. And the orchard, Lila said, remembering his earlier words. You mentioned space for fruit trees. South Slope gets good sun most of the day. Soil's rich, and there's a spring that never runs dry. His eyes lit with enthusiasm. Could plant apples, maybe some pears. Cherries do well at this elevation too. How long before they'd bear fruit? 3, 4 years maybe. 5 for a full crop. The time frame implied permanence, planning beyond the immediate future into the realm of true partnership. By the time those trees bore fruit, they might have children to help with the harvest. The thought should have overwhelmed her, but instead it filled her with quiet joy. There's something else, Elias said as the fire burned low. Something we should discuss before. He gestured vaguely toward the bedroom alcove. She followed his gaze and understood. They were married now in his eyes, in the tradition of the mountains. But she was still healing from loss, still learning to trust again. What are you asking? Time, he said simply. As much as you need. We can share the cabin, share our lives, without, I won't expect, he struggled with the words, color rising in his weathered cheeks. She reached out and touched his face gently, understanding his careful courtesy. You're saying you'll wait until I'm ready. However long it takes, the patience implicit in the offer moved her almost to tears. Here was a man who'd waited 15 years for love to find him, and he was willing to wait longer still for her, to heal completely. And if I'm never ready, if the grief runs too deep, then we'll find other ways to build our family. There are orphans in every settlement, children who need homes and parents who'd love them. His certainty was absolute. Love makes a family, Lila. Not blood, not obligation, love. The simplicity of it, the fundamental rightness, settled something deep in her chest that had been restless since Thomas died. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just safety or companionship, but partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. I think, she said carefully, that healing might come faster than either of us expects. When it's the right person, the right time, the right reasons. Hope flickered in his pale eyes. And you think this might be those things? I think this is everything I didn't dare hope for when I was running scared through the wilderness. She smiled, surprised by how natural it felt. I think Thomas would approve, and that's not something I expected to be able to say. They banked the fire and prepared for sleep, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd shared space and danger and the recognition of mutual affection. The bedroom alcove seemed less daunting now, transformed from a stranger's retreat into the beginning of their shared sanctuary. As she settled into the warm quilts, Lila fingered the smooth stone that had become her wedding ring. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the practical work of building a life together, the ongoing process of healing and growth, the delicate business of learning to trust love again. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt truly safe, not just protected, but cherished. And in the steady breathing of the man who'd become her husband, she heard the promise of all the tomorrows they'd build together, one careful stone at a time. Spring came early to the high country that year, arriving with a rush of snowmelt and the return of birdsong to the pine forests. Lila woke on a morning in late March to find the world transformed, green shoots pushing through the last patches of snow, wildflowers dotting the meadows, and the sound of running water everywhere as the mountain streams swelled with winter's release. She and Elias had spent the winter months in careful domesticity, learning the rhythms of married life with the patience of people who understood that good things took time to build properly. The cabin had grown by 2 rooms, with Elias working steadily through the cold months to expand their living space. A proper bedroom now occupied the space where the sleeping alcove had been, while the original alcove had been converted into a nursery that waited hopefully for future occupants. But it was the rifle she discovered missing from its usual place. Beside the door that told her this particular morning would be different from the peaceful routine they'd established. Elias, she called, stepping onto the porch that now wrapped around 2 sides of the cabin. She found him standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle held ready across his chest, staring down the mountain trail with an intensity that raised the hair on her arms. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the alert stillness that meant trouble. "What is it?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. "Riders," he said quietly. 3 of them, maybe 4. Been watching them work their way up the valley for the past hour. Lila shaded her eyes with her hand, squinting down the trail until she caught sight of movement among the trees. Horsemen, riding hard and purposeful, sending up small clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. "Could be travelers," she said, but her hand moved instinctively to touch Thomas's rifle where she'd propped it beside the door. "Could be." Elias's tone suggested he didn't believe it any more than she did. But travelers don't usually ride that hard unless they're running from something, or toward it. As they watched, the riders broke from the tree line into the lower meadow, close enough now for details to become clear. 3 men on horseback, all armed, all wearing the kind of rough clothes that suggested they weren't here for social calls. Not Hutchins's men, Lila observed. Those are all dead or scattered. No, but the territory's got plenty of other men willing to kill for the right price. Elias's jaw was tight with something that looked like resignation mixed with determination. Question is, what price brought them to my mountain? The answer came sooner than expected. The lead rider spurred his horse up the final stretch of trail, close enough now for his voice to carry clearly across the clearing. "Elias Granger! We know you're up there. Come down peaceful-like, and we can discuss this like civilized men." Tihidu. Voice was unfamiliar, but something about the phrasing, the false reasonableness layered over unmistakable threat, reminded her unpleasantly of Wade Hutchins. Apparently some lessons were universal among men who made their living through intimidation. "What do you want?" Elias called back, but he was already moving, using hand signals to direct Lila toward better cover. "Just want to have a conversation about some property that belongs to our employer. Nothing that can't be worked out between reasonable folks." Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain morning. Property, that was what Hutchins had called Thomas's land too, just before he murdered him for it. "Whose property?" she called, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. There was a pause, followed by what sounded like murmured consultation among the riders. Then the leader called back, "Mrs. Monroe, good to know you're still alive. Our employer's been very concerned about your welfare." The false concern in his voice made her skin crawl. "Who's your employer?" "Man by the name of Harrison Blake. Says he's got legitimate claim to the land your late husband thought he owned. Just wants to discuss the matter with you direct-like. Make sure there's no hard feelings." Blake. The name meant nothing to her, but something about the way the man spoke it, with a deference that bordered on fear, suggested their employer was someone accustomed to getting his way through methods that didn't involve discussion. "Never heard of him," she called back. "Well, he's heard plenty about you, Mrs. Monroe, and about the mountain man you're keeping company with. Seems there might be some confusion about ownership of this particular piece of territory." Elias had gone very still beside her, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. When he spoke, his voice was pitched for her ears alone. "They're stalling, keeping us talking while the other 2 get into position." She followed his gaze and caught sight of movement in the trees to their left, barely visible figures working their way around the clearing, trying to establish crossfire positions. "What do we do?" "Same thing we did last time. Fight together, trust each other, and remember that some things are worth dying for." He met her eyes directly. "But there's something else, Lila. Something I need to tell you before this goes any further." The seriousness in his tone made her stomach clench. "What?" "That land your husband claimed, the one with the gold, it wasn't just valuable for what was in the ground." His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the weight of old secrets beneath the words. "It sits right on top of the main, and pass through the Bitterroots. Control that pass, and you control all the trade moving between the territories." The implications hit her like a physical blow. It was never about the gold. Gold was just an excuse, a way to justify taking what they really wanted. "That pass is worth more than all the precious metal in Montana Territory, especially to men with the right political connections. And this Blake, railroad money most likely, or government contracts, maybe both." Elias's expression was grim. The kind of man who doesn't take no for an answer, who sees obstacles as things to be removed rather than negotiated with. The knowledge changed everything. This wasn't just about claim jumping or even systematic theft. This was about control of an entire territory's economic future, with her late husband's homestead as the key to unlocking millions of dollars in potential profit. "How long have you known?" she asked. Suspected it when you told me about Thomas finding gold right on the main trail. Confirmed it when I saw the maps in Hutchins's saddlebags. He shifted his grip on his rifle, checking the action with the automatic movements of long practice. Was going to tell you after winter broke, when we could make plans to leave if we needed to. Leave! The word came out sharper than she'd intended. This mountain's been my home for 15 years, but it's not worth your life, or the life of our children, if God blesses us with them. His voice carried absolute conviction. We can build a new home anywhere, but we can't build a new life if we're dead. The sound of horses moving through the trees was getting closer now, the riders taking their time to ensure they had all the advantages before making their final approach. In the distance, she could hear the leader still calling out false reassurances, trying to keep them distracted while his men moved into position. "Mrs. Monroe, my employer's prepared to be very generous about compensation for any inconvenience. Just need to discuss the details face to face." Lila touched the smooth stone that had become her wedding ring, drawing strength from its warm weight. Then she picked up Thomas's rifle, checking the load with movements that had become second nature over the long winter months. "I'm not running anymore," she said quietly. "This is our home now, our mountain. If they want it, they'll have to take it from us." Elias looked at her for a long moment, something that might have been pride flickering in his pale eyes. Then he nodded slowly. "Together, then. Whatever comes, together," she agreed. The first shot came without further warning, fired from the trees to their left by one of the men who'd been trying to flank them. The bullet splintered the porch railing inches from where Lila stood, and suddenly the morning peace was shattered by the thunder of gunfire. Elias's rifle answered immediately, and she heard someone scream in the distance. But there were still at least 2 others out there, and the leader was spurring his horse forward, firing as he came. This time, she was ready. Thomas's rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the charging rider threw up his arms and tumbled from his saddle. But even as he fell, she could see another figure moving through the trees on their right, trying to get a clear shot at Elias's back. "Behind you!" she called, already working her rifle's action. Elias spun and fired in one smooth motion, and the flanking gunman's rifle went silent. But the victory was short-lived. More shots were coming from the tree line, at least 2 more men who'd been hidden in reserve. "Too many," Elias said grimly, reloading as fast as his wounded shoulder would allow. They came prepared this time. Lila fired toward the muzzle flash she'd glimpsed among the pines, then ducked back into cover as return fire chewed splinters from the cabin wall. Her heart was racing, but her hands were steady. Whatever else happened, she wouldn't go down. Without a fight, the battle was just beginning, and she could already tell it would be different from their encounter with Hutchins. These men were professionals, well-equipped and carefully coordinated. They'd studied the failure of the previous attack and come prepared to overwhelm through superior numbers and tactics. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed she was still the same terrified widow who'd fled her burning homestead. That woman had died in the flames, along with her old life. The woman who stood beside Elias now was someone new, someone who'd learned that love was worth fighting for, and that some ground was too precious to surrender. The rifles cracked again. In the mountain morning, and Lila Monroe Granger prepared to defend everything she'd found worth living for. The battle raged with an intensity that made their previous encounter with Hutchins seem like a minor skirmish. These attackers were professionals, coordinated and relentless, pressing their assault from multiple directions while maintaining disciplined fire. Every time Lila or Elias moved to counter one threat, another would emerge from an unexpected angle. But the months of living together had taught them to work as a team, and the defensive positions Elias had prepared around the cabin during the winter proved their worth. They moved with practiced efficiency, covering each other's reloads, communicating with gestures and glances rather than words that might give away their positions. "Left side," Lila called, spotting movement near the woodshed. Elias swung his rifle around and fired, driving the flanking gunman back into cover. But the momentary distraction allowed another attacker to break from the trees on the right, sprinting toward the cabin with a revolver in each hand. This time it was Lila who fired, her shot taking the man center mass and spinning him to the ground. But even as he fell, she could see more figures moving in the tree line, at least 3 more men, maybe 4, all positioned to pour fire into the cabin from different angles. "How many did Blake send?" she gasped, working her rifle's action with hands that were steady despite the chaos around them. "Too many," Elias replied grimly. "This isn't just about claiming land anymore. This is about making sure no one else ever tries to stand in their way." The truth of it hit her like a cold wind. Blake's men weren't just here to take possession of the strategic pass. They were here to send a message. Anyone who dared resist the territorial power brokers would end up like the stubborn mountain man and his wife, buried in unmarked graves where their defiance could never inspire others. "The tunnel," Elias said suddenly, "the one I dug to connect with the cave system. If we can reach it—" "No." Lila's voice was steel-hard with determination. "I won't run anymore. This is our home, and if we abandon it now, we'll be running for the rest of our lives." A fresh volley of shots struck the cabin, sending splinters flying and punching holes through the carefully chinked logs. One bullet passed so close to Lila's head that she felt the wind of its passage, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted position and sent her own shot toward the muzzle flash that had betrayed the shooter's location. "Then we make our stand here," Elias said, and she heard something in his voice that hadn't been there during their fight with Hutchins, a kind of fierce joy, as if he'd finally found a cause worthy of the warrior he'd once been. They fought with the desperation of people who had everything to lose and the skill of partners who trusted each other completely. When Elias's wounded shoulder began to affect his aim, Lila moved to cover his weak side without being asked. When her ammunition ran low, he tossed her his spare cartridges while maintaining fire with his sidearm. But despite their efforts, the attackers were slowly gaining ground, working their way closer to the cabin under cover of superior numbers and sustained fire. Soon they'd be close enough to rush the building, and no amount of skill or determination would be enough to hold off a coordinated assault. That's when the first of Blake's men made a crucial mistake. In his eagerness to get close enough for a killing shot, he broke cover too early, exposing himself in the gap between 2 large pine trees. Lila saw him first, swinging her rifle around and firing in one smooth motion, but it wasn't her bullet that brought him down. The shot came from behind the attackers, from the direction of the main trail, and it was followed immediately by the sound of many horses moving fast through the forest. Blake's men, caught between the cabin defenders and this new threat, suddenly found themselves fighting on 2 fronts. "Cavalry!" Elias shouted, recognizing the coordinated movement and disciplined fire of military units. Captain Morrison's voice cut through the gunfire like a sword through silk. "United States Army, lay down your weapons and surrender, or we'll cut you down where you stand." The effect was immediate and decisive. Blake's hired guns, professional killers though they were, had no interest in facing a full cavalry troop in open battle. 3 of them broke and ran immediately, disappearing into the forest like shadows fleeing sunlight. The remaining 2 tried to make a fight of it, but caught between the cabin's defenders and Morrison's soldiers, they lasted less than a minute. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was almost deafening. Lila's ears rang from the sustained gunfire, and smoke drifted through the clearing like morning mist. She found herself still holding Thomas's rifle, finger on the trigger, scanning for threats that were no longer there. "It's over," Elias said, quietly, touching her shoulder with his good hand. "They're gone." Captain Morrison appeared at the edge of the clearing, leading a dozen mounted troopers and looking grimly satisfied with the morning's work. His uniform bore the dust of hard riding, and his expression suggested this had been more than a routine. "Patrol, Mr. and Mrs. Granger," he called, dismounting and approaching the cabin with his hands visible and empty. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing serious," Elias replied, though Lila could see him favoring his wounded shoulder more heavily than before. The morning's fighting had undoubtedly reopened the injury Hutchins had given him. "Good. I'm afraid this isn't the last of it. And though Harrison Blake is a man with deep pockets and shallow morals. He'll send more men, if these don't report back." "Then let him come," Lila said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "We'll be ready." Morrison studied her for a moment, then nodded with something that might have been respect. "I believe you would be, but it shouldn't come to that." He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio thick with official documents. Blake made one crucial mistake. He tried to buy off a federal judge to get a ruling on the mineral rights to your land. Unfortunately for him, Judge, Harrison is an honest man who reports bribery attempts to the appropriate authorities, meaning Harrison Blake is about to find himself under federal investigation for corruption, conspiracy, and about a dozen other charges that should keep him busy in court for the next several years. Morrison's smile was sharp as winter starlight. "Hard to hire assassins when all your assets are frozen pending trial." The relief was so sudden and overwhelming that Lila's knees nearly gave out. She sank onto the porch steps, Thomas's rifle glattering beside her as the last of her adrenaline finally faded. "It's really over?" she asked. "This part is," Morrison confirmed. "Blake's operation is finished, and word will spread that the Granger homestead is under federal protection. Should discourage any other enterprising criminals from testing your resolve." Elias moved to sit beside her on the steps, his arms settling gently around her shoulders. The gesture was protective but not possessive, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. "What about the land?" he asked. "The mineral rights, the pass. What happens now?" "According to federal law, they belong to whoever holds legal claim to the surface rights, which as of this morning would be you." Morrison gestured toward the portfolio of documents. "Mrs. Granger's inheritance from her late husband, properly, transferred to her current spouse under territorial marriage laws. All legal, all binding, all protected by the full authority of the United States government." The words took a moment to sink in. They weren't just safe. They were legitimate landowners with legal claim to one of the most valuable strategic positions in Montana Territory. The gold Thomas had found was only the beginning. The real wealth lay in controlling access to the mountain pass that would someday carry railroads and commerce across the Continental Divide. "We're rich," Lila said wonderingly. "You're secure," Morrison corrected, "which is worth more than riches in country like this." As the soldiers began the grim work of clearing away the bodies of Blake's men, Lila found herself thinking about the future in ways that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. They could expand the cabin into a proper house, maybe even a way station for travelers using the pass. They could plant that orchard Elias had planned, raise children who would grow up knowing they belonged somewhere safe and permanent. "The wooden rings," she said suddenly, remembering their makeshift wedding ceremony. "What about them? You said we'd have the preacher say proper words over us when the circuit rider came through." She touched the smooth stone that had become more precious to her than any gold band. "But I think maybe we don't need anyone else to make this official. What we have, what we chose together, that's already as real as anything gets." Elias's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "You sure about that? No regrets about marrying a man with more ghosts than good sense?" She thought about everything they'd been through, everything they'd survived together. The fear and violence, yes, but also the quiet mornings and shared meals and the gentle way he carved toys for children who didn't yet exist. "No regrets," she said firmly, "not about anything that led us here." "Then we're married," he said simply. "By stone and by choice, by battle and by blood. As official as anything needs to be." She leaned against his solid warmth, feeling the last of her defenses finally crumble into something that might become trust. might become hope, might even become the kind of love that lasted beyond fear and loss, and all the ways the world tried to break good people. In her pocket, the mountain, stone warmed against her fingers, smooth as a promise and twice as enduring. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to build the life they'd chosen together. But today, they were alive and safe and home. And for the first time since her world had burned down around her, Lila Monroe Granger found herself truly believing in forever. 9 months later, the first cry echoed through the expanded cabin just as the spring sun crested the mountain peaks. Lila had labored through the night with Elias, holding her hand, and the territorial doctor, summoned by telegraph from Helena, offering quiet encouragement and professional expertise. "It's a boy," Dr. Matthews announced, lifting the red-faced, squalling infant with practiced ease. Strong lungs, good color, all his fingers and toes accounted for. Elias looked down at his son with an expression of wonder so profound it brought tears to Lila's eyes. This giant of a man, who'd faced down armies and killers without flinching, seemed almost afraid to touch the tiny bundle that represented everything he'd dreamed of for 15 years. "Go ahead," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the long night's work. "He's yours too." With infinite care, Elias gathered the baby against his chest, his large hands cradling the small head with the same gentle precision he'd once used to carve toys from blocks of wood. The infant's crying subsided as if recognizing the safety of his father's embrace. "Thomas," Lila said softly, watching her husband's face transform with paternal love. "His name is Thomas, after my first husband, Thomas Granger." Elias looked up at her, understanding immediately why she'd chosen to honor the man whose death had ultimately led to this moment of joy. "Thomas Granger," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "Welcome to the world, son." The cabin around them bore little resemblance to the rough shelter where they'd weathered their first winter together. What had once been a single room with a sleeping alcove was now a proper house, expanded and refined through months of careful labor. The main room still centered around the stone fireplace, but it was joined now by a formal dining area, a modern kitchen with a pump that drew water from the spring, and 3 bedrooms that could accommodate a growing family. The nursery, finally occupied after years of patient preparation, glowed with warm morning light streaming through windows that looked out over the mountain valley they now controlled. The cherry wood cradle that had waited so long for its first occupant was surrounded by all the careful preparations Elias had made, toys carved with loving attention, blankets sewn by the women of Bear Creek Settlement, and books of stories waiting to be read aloud during countless bedtime hours. "Mrs. Granger," Dr. Matthews said, packing his instruments with professional satisfaction, "you've done remarkably well for a first-time mother. The boy is healthy, the delivery was textbook perfect, and you should recover completely within a few weeks." "Thank you," she murmured, though her attention was fixed on her husband and son. Elias had settled into the rocking chair he'd built during the winter months. The baby nestled against his shoulder while he hummed a wordless lullaby in his deep, rumbling voice. "I'll check on you both in a few days," the doctor continued, "but I don't anticipate any complications. You're fortunate to live in such a well-appointed home. Not every frontier birth enjoys such luxury." Luxury was an apt description for what their mountain home had become. The success of their legitimate claim to the pass had brought prosperity beyond their wildest dreams. The railroad surveyors had arrived in late summer, confirming what everyone had suspected. The route through Granger Pass, as the maps now labeled it, would carry the transcontinental line across the Bitterroot Mountains, rather than simply sell the land to the railroad interests. Elias and Lila had negotiated a partnership that gave them a percentage of all traffic that passed through their territory. The initial payment had funded the expansion of their home and the establishment of a way station that served travelers, surveyors, and eventually would serve railroad passengers. But more important than the financial security was what the legitimacy had brought them: acceptance in the broader community, respect from territorial officials, and the kind of social standing that would ensure their children grew up as full citizens rather than outcasts. The settlement of Bear Creek, once a collection of rough cabins and suspicious residents, had grown into a proper town with a school, a church, and even a small newspaper that reported on the doings of the territory's most famous couple. The Beauty and the Beast of the Bitterroots, as one Eastern journalist had dubbed them, had become something of a legend. The refined widow who'd tamed the savage mountain man through love and determination. Lila found the characterization both amusing and irritating. There had been no taming involved, merely two people finding in each other exactly what they needed to become complete. Elias was no savage, and she was no saint. They were simply partners who'd chosen to build something lasting in a place where most people only survived. "The orchard's coming along nicely," Elias said softly, still rocking the sleeping baby. "Should have our first real crop next year, if the weather cooperates." Through the window, Lila could see the fruit trees they'd planted that spring, already showing the strong growth that promised future abundance. Apple, pear, and cherry trees marched in neat rows across the south-facing slope, their leaves bright, green with new life. And the garden? Better than expected. That new strain of potatoes the agricultural agent recommended should do well at this elevation. Plus, we've got more vegetables than we can eat, even with feeding the way station guests. The easy domesticity of the conversation, husband and wife discussing crops and household management while their newborn son slept peacefully between them, represented everything they'd both dreamed of during their separate years of loneliness. This was what they'd fought for, what they'd risked everything to protect. "Do you ever miss it?" Lila asked. "The solitude, the simplicity of living alone?" Elias considered the question seriously, his pale eyes moving from the baby in his arms to the woman who'd transformed his life completely. "Sometimes I miss the quiet," he admitted. 15 years of hearing nothing but wind and wildlife, that becomes a part of you. But I wouldn't trade a single day of what we have now for all the peaceful solitude in the world, even when the baby's crying at 3 in the morning, especially then." His smile was soft with anticipation. "I've waited 35 years to be woken up by my own child. I plan to enjoy every sleepless night." A knock at the door interrupted their peaceful morning, followed by a familiar voice calling out, "Hello, the house! Anyone awake in there?" "That'll be Captain Morrison," Elias said, carefully transferring the baby to Lila before moving to answer the door. Morrison entered with his usual air of competent authority, but his formal bearing softened when he saw the domestic scene before him. "I heard the news from Dr. Matthews. Congratulations to you both." "Thank you, Captain. What brings you up the mountain so early?" "Official business, I'm afraid, though it's good news." Morrison withdrew a familiar leather portfolio from his saddlebags. "The federal investigation into Harrison Blake has concluded. He's been sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, and his co-conspirators have received similar punishments. And his assets forfeited to the territory as restitution for his crimes. Some of it will go to compensate the families of his victims, but there's a substantial reward due to the people whose testimony made the conviction possible." Morrison's smile suggested the amount was significant. "Should be enough to fund that school you've been talking about building." The school had been Lila's idea, born from memories of Thomas's belief that education was the foundation of civilization. With their financial security established, she'd begun planning an institution that would serve not just their own children, but the families throughout the territory who wanted something better for the next generation. "How substantial?" Elias asked. "Substantial enough that you could build a proper academy, hire real teachers from back east, maybe even establish a scholarship fund for promising students." Morrison handed over the documents. "Blake stole from a lot of people over the years. Justice demands that his victims benefit from his downfall. As Lila read through the legal papers, she realized they were looking at enough money to transform not just their own lives, but the entire region. A proper school would attract more families, which would support more businesses, which would accelerate the development that the railroad would inevitably bring. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "The territorial governor has asked me to offer you a position, Mr. Granger, Deputy Territorial Marshal, based here in the Bitterroots, with authority over the entire mountain district." The offer hung in the air like a bridge between past and future. Elias had spent 15 years avoiding any connection to organized authority, but the badge Morrison was offering represented legitimacy, respectability, and the chance to protect others the way Captain Morrison had protected them. "I'm honored by the governor's confidence," Elias said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm the right man for that kind of responsibility." "With respect, sir, you're exactly the right man. You know this country better than anyone. You've proven your courage and judgment under fire, and the people here trust you." Morrison's voice carried the weight of conviction. "The territory needs men like you in positions of authority, men who understand the difference between justice and revenge." Lila watched her husband wrestle with the decision, seeing the appeal of legitimate authority warring with his natural distrust of official power. Finally, she spoke up. "What would it mean, practically? Day to day, I mean. Keep the peace, investigate serious crimes, coordinate with the army when necessary, based here at your home so you wouldn't need to relocate." Morrison gestured toward the sleeping infant. "Family-friendly position, with a salary that would supplement your other income nicely." "The badge comes with respect," Lila observed quietly. "Our son would grow up as a lawman's child, not a hermit's. That matters." Elias looked down at little Thomas, still sleeping peacefully despite the conversation swirling around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady with decision. "I accept," he said simply, "on the condition that my first official act is to deputize my wife. She's proven herself more than capable in a fight, and she knows this territory as well as I." Morrison blinked in surprise. "I'm not sure the territorial government has ever had a female deputy." "Then it's time they did." Elias's tone brooked no argument. "We're partners in everything else. We should be partners in this too." The captain considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "The statute doesn't specify gender requirements for deputy positions. If you want to make history, that's your prerogative." Then it's settled. Lila felt a surge of pride and anticipation. "Deputy Marshal and Deputy Marshal Granger, at your service." As Morrison prepared to leave, he paused at the door for one final observation. "You know, when I first met you both, I thought I was looking at two people who'd been beaten down by circumstances beyond their control. I never imagined you'd end up as the most successful couple in Montana territory." "Success isn't about what you accumulate," Elias said, cradling his son with infinite gentleness. "It's about what you build that lasts beyond your own lifetime." After Morrison departed, they spent the rest of the morning in peaceful domesticity. Lila recovering from her labor, Elias learning the basics of diaper changing and infant care, both of them marveling at the small miracle they'd created together. The afternoon brought visitors from Bear Creek, neighbors who'd made the journey to offer congratulations and bring gifts for the new arrival. The widow Thompson arrived with a basket of baby clothes she'd sewn herself. The blacksmith and his wife brought a small silver cup engraved with the child's name. Even the stern minister who served the circuit came by to offer his blessing and schedule a proper christening. As the sun set over the mountain valley they'd fought so hard to call home, Lila found herself standing at the window with Thomas in her arms, watching Elias tend to their horses with the same careful attention he brought to everything he loved. "Look there, little one," she whispered to her son. "See that man? That's your father, the strongest and gentlest man in all the world. Someday you'll be just like him, brave when you need to be, kind always, and smart enough to know the difference." The Baby stirred against her shoulder, tiny fingers grasping at the fabric of her dress, and she felt the last pieces of her old grief finally settle into something that felt like peace. Thomas, both her Thomases, would always be part of her story, but they were no longer the whole story. Outside, Elias finished his evening chores and turned toward the house, his face lighting up when he spotted her silhouette in the window. Even after all these months, after marriage and partnership and now parenthood, he still looked at her like she was something miraculous. And perhaps she was. Perhaps they both were. Two broken people who'd found in each other not just healing, but transformation into something neither could have become alone. The mountain stone was still warm in her pocket, worn smooth by months of carrying. There, wedding ring, carved from the very bones of the mountains where they'd chosen to build their life, as permanent as the peaks themselves, and twice as enduring as any promise made with gold or silver. Little Thomas opened his eyes, pale green, like his father's, but with something of his mother's determination already visible in their depths. He was the future, made manifest, hope given form, the next chapter in a story that had begun with fear and loss and transformed into something that looked remarkably like forever. Sometimes the thing we fear most is exactly what we need to heal, our broken hearts. Sometimes the person who looks most dangerous is the one who will keep us safest. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we find that the mountain can teach us to build something stronger than stone, more lasting than time, and more precious than all the gold hidden in the earth's secret places. Love, made visible in the laughter of children and the steady presence of a partner who chooses us new every single day.